أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajjil farajahum. Brothers, sisters, and respected viewers, wherever you may be, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And allow me to start by expressing my condolences on the sad events around the martyrdom of the second of our Imams, Imam al-Hassan al Mujtaba, the son of Imam Ali alayhi salam and Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us His intercession in the afterlife. The organizing brothers have asked me to spend a couple of lectures discussing a very important topic in the life of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. And this is the topic of the peace treaty, and inshallah we're going to come to that nomenclature, that wording, the peace treaty that was signed between Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam and Muawyiah. Generally speaking, when we look at history, and Islamic history in particular, history is a complex topic. Sometimes I think we may have the impression that having a good understanding of history simply requires that one goes through the books of history and goes through the chronological order of events to understand what happened and form a solid opinion about the events and their context and the why behind the decisions and so on and so forth, when in reality this is not always true. It may be the case, but generally speaking this is going to be the exception, not the rule. History, historians tell us, is usually written by those who are in power and those who are rulers, and Islamic history to a large extent is no different. And then you add to that the various components and the various dimensions of the writing of history. And today, inshallah, perhaps we're going to be exposed to a little bit of that as we go through a little bit of the analysis around the history that we have around Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. All this to say, I think in general, sadness and the grief of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, where we get to hear a lot of historical facts, a lot of chronological narration and reporting of events. And it will absolutely be normal to hear some discrepancies and some variance and some difference of opinions because this scholar or that scholar has a different reading or interpretation of certain events or who said what, when, and why. And so I think anyone who embarks on any sort of historical research needs to be fully aware that history requires a little bit of an analysis to properly understand the context. And it's not just a one-layer superficial reading of the facts that is going to be sufficient for one to be acquiring a full, comprehensive, complete understanding of any historical events. And so one has to be always coming in with an objective but open mind and willing to perhaps accept, at least consider, not necessarily accept, but at least consider different points of view than the ones that you may have been accustomed to, or the ones that you've heard until now, or the ones that you've read or thought about. So this is just some general remarks. All this to say, sometimes once you delve into history, and if you do it with an open mind and objectively, you will often be confronted with opinions that are different than the ones you've been hearing or reading, and you need to take all of those into consideration and analyze them and assess them and really try to see to what extent are they valid or worthy of consideration or not. And the history and the lives of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, including the events of Karbala, including the lives of people like Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam that we're going to be discussing today, are no different than all of that. The life of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam has been looked at from two big dimensions or two big angles. The first one is the biography of the Imam, his life in general. From the time he was born until the time he passes away, his companions, the things that kind of the big events, who he spent time with, ahsantum, and so on and so forth. And then sometimes, and this is the case for all of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, you want to concentrate on one dimension a little bit more than the others. And so there's a lot of history written about Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, specifically with regards to his political life, his political involvement. And if you look at his political life, the most important event in that life is the chapter that has to do with the peace treaty that was signed between him and Muawyiah. It's not going to be a very, easy, superficial reading that's going to allow us to get to the bottom of what happened and why did it happen and how are we to understand the details around this peace treaty. So, in general, I would say, first of all, when it comes to the life of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, it's very unfortunate, but it's not one of the Imams that we talk more about. We may talk about him at the events surrounding his birth and the events surrounding his martyrdom, as we are doing right now. And for anyone who wants to have an in-depth understanding of the life of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, which is full of complexity from a historical perspective, or the peace treaty specifically, you can't think that you're going to be able to cover a lot of the details in one or two short sittings, or even one or two books. You would need to look at the different variants that you find in all of this and come up with your conclusion over time. So what we're going to be doing now is to spend 2 lectures talking specifically about the peace treaty of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. In this first lecture, we want to concentrate on the problem, the problematic image that we find in many sources of history with regards to the peace treaty of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. And as we will discover today, it's kind of impossible to talk about the peace treaty in isolation from talking about with the life of Imam al-Hassan in general. And as we will see, the historians and the historical sources very quickly link and even justify and contextualize the reasons behind the peace treaty by going to the character of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam and referring to different dimensions of his life in general. So while we're going to be focusing on the peace treaty itself, this is going to necessarily lead us into some other dimensions of the life of the Imam. As we said in this first of the lectures, what we're going to try to do is to present the problematic image, the image that we find in a lot of the sources of history, and we're going to enumerate a few of them. In the next lecture, we will inshaAllah focus on trying to find the actual authentic version, or the version that we can rely on a lot more as being much more probably the authentic version of history when it comes to the life of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, and specifically the peace treaty between him and Muawyiah. A very quick terminological detail. Should we be talking about a peace treaty, or is there a more precise terminology that goes around this? In Arabic, the term that has been used more often is al-sulh, sulh al-Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, which is usually translated as the peace treaty. Some of our scholars have objected to this, and they've said that it was not actually a sulh, it was not a treaty between two parties, it was more of a hudna or hidna, which basically can be translated more as a truce or an amnesty, and is more representative of the actual situation that was taking place, which is two camps are at war, and then they both agree to, from this point on, while respecting certain conditions, enter into a period of peace. So no longer battling, warring each other. If you go back to the etymology and the definitions of these terms, even in Arabic, the truth is there is not that much difference between the use of sulh and the use of hudna. That's first. Secondly, even if you go back to some of the narrations of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and some of them coming directly to us from Imam Hassan alayhi salam himself, he has referred to that thing that was agreed upon between him and Muawiyah as a sulh or musalaha himself. And both terms exist in the riwayat, as we have said. So I think we can use the terms interchangeably, but the details are going to be important, and we will get to those inshallah in the next lecture. The sources of the life of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, and specifically the peace treaty. And why is there so much complexity around it, as we alluded to? Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam lived at a very sensitive time, very complex time in Islamic history. And in addition to that, there was a transition at his time or around his time in the manner in which the Muslims were ruled, and it had very big repercussions on things to follow. So when we come to the history of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, we're going to find layers of history. And this is where my invitation to anyone who is interested in history is to spend time understanding how these layers of history form over time, and they give us the image that, for instance, we have today. You need to understand where some of this is coming from over history. There are 4 big sources, and of course this is going to be a very cursory, very high-level presentation of these. This is not the focus for today, but I think it serves to give us a little bit of the context for the main piece that I want to present, which is the Orientalist perception. There are 4 main sources when it comes to the history of Imam al-Hassan, and specifically the political dimension that has to do with the peace treaty of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. The first one is the one that we find from the Umayyads, from Bani Umayyah. And with time, today, if you look at the majority of the Muslim historians, when they talk about the life of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, and when they talk about the peace treaty between him and Muawiyah, a lot of what they say actually comes from the Umayyi, the Umayyad version of history that was drafted and crafted during the time of the Imam and onwards. And we're going to come to some of those details. The second group of people who introduced a lot of notions and a lot of historical details and context around the life of Imam al-Hassan and the peace treaty specifically are the Abbassids, are Bani al-Abbas, from the moment they took the Khilafah after the Umayyads onwards. And we're going to come to some examples of that. And then from the beginning, there was a third group. Let's just refer to them for now as the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. And those are the ones who have always believed in the infallibility of the Imams, including Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. And they have a special position that they grant to the justification and to the words of their Imams, including Imam al-Hassan, when he explains what happened in the peace treaty, for instance. And we will come to that, but this one we're leaving aside for sure today, and we'll inshallah come to some of that in the next lecture. The fourth group are the Orientalists. The Orientalists, inshallah, we're talking about them in a few moments to explain why we think it's an important source of knowledge and information to see what the Orientalists have said. And this goes beyond the life of Imam al-Hassan or his peace treaty. So in many ways for today, I hope that you view what we're going to present from the point of view of the Orientalist image of Imam al-Hassan and his peace treaty as a case study that you can apply to all sorts of other dimensions and chapters of Islamic thought to understand how your religion, the religion of Islam, is perceived and then presented to the world. So the first source, as we said, of historic context and historic data that we have from around the life and the peace treaty of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam are Bani Umayyah, the Umayyads. In short, and as you know, we don't have time to go through the details here. So very quickly, the Umayyads version of what happened in the time of Imam al-Hassan between him and Muawiyah, from the moment that Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam becomes the Khalifa after the assassination of Imam Ali alayhi salam. The Umayyads version tells us that right from the beginning, Muawiyah is the one who moved very quickly to establish a peace treaty between himself and Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. And the reason why we are told he did this is that Muawiyah saw a great benefit to the Islamic world in creating a united front, a harmonious Islamic society, a harmonious ummah, where there is no warring and no battle going on internally. And Muawiyah believed so much in this vision and so much in this value of making sure that peace and harmony are going to reign and Muslims are going to be united, that he was willing to spend and to spend very generously to ensure that this is actually going to take place. So what does Muawiyah do? He embarks on a sort of a negotiation with Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, and he is willing to give a lot of money in exchange for convincing Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam to accept this peace treaty for the greater good of the Islamic world. And so Muawiyah gives and gives until Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam is convinced, agrees, accepts what Muawiyah is giving, even though it may look like it's absolutely an exaggerated amount, that Muawiyah gave too much. Muawiyah believed so much in this peace and united world, peaceful and united world in the Islamic kingdom, that he was willing to put in the money that goes with it. And he knew that Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam was very much in need of that money and very much wanted that money. And we're going to come back to that in a second. And so the outcome, the perception or the vision that you get from this is that Muawiyah is someone who was very concerned with peace and unity and harmony and having a united front in the Islamic world. And he was a man of conviction and principle. And this is in severe contrast to the personality of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, who in his case was definitely not a man of conviction and value, because he was willing to basically be bribed, be bought off with the generosity of Muawiyah. And there's an insistence in this version of history, there is a lot of insistence on a narration that they report, they attribute to the Holy Prophet ﷺ, in which he would have said about Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam when he was very young, that this son of mine is a Sayyid, a master, and through him Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to unite two very big factions of the Muslim world, of the Muslim Ummah. And so they referred to that hadith a lot, saying that, see how the Holy Prophet prophesied that Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam was going to play that role. And so Muawiyah is the one who basically mediated and allowed this to happen. And this is already very troublesome, very problematic, because if you actually believe that this attributed narration to the Holy Prophet is authentic, then you would be making sure that, or attributing the merit of having created a peaceful situation, a harmonious situation, to Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, as him having been the one who orchestrates this, and therefore the one deserving of the credit and deserving of the praise, and not Muawiyah, as happened later. That's something just to simply keep in mind. And the other problematic issue with this presentation is that it is true that Muawiyah tried certain things to negotiate certain things right from the beginning with Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, but it was not this peace treaty that they are referring to, or that came to be. That's not what was proposed by Muawiyah. Anyone who will go in history, and inshallah we'll talk quickly about that next time, but what basically Muawiyah presented to Imam al-Hassan was that Imam al-Hassan may remain a Khalifa over his part of the world, and Muawiyah remains a Khalifa over his own part of the world. The people who wanted Muawiyah and over whom Muawiyah was already ruling would remain as his part of the Islamic Ummah, and Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam would become the Khalifa on the rest of the Islamic world, and Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam rejected that. But that's what happened at the beginning of the Khilafah, of the taking over of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. And so, if you go through history, if you go through the early narrators and reporters of historical events in the time of Bani Umayyah and onwards, this is the version that they drafted and carefully crafted, and it was very well embellished, very well crafted, put together in a way that seems extremely well, very credible. Anyone who would look at it would say, yes, this does look like this is exactly what would have happened, and it explains every big detail. And inshallah, we're going to come to those details later. There were certainly seeds in there, as we alluded to, of things attacking the character of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, but they were not direct. And a lot of this, as we said, was being crafted and drafted and said during the Khilafah and during the existence and the lifetime of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. Then we come to Bani al-Abbas. And you go through their earliest historians, or when they started talking, Bani al-Abbas started talking about the life of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam and the peace treaty between him and Muawiyah. And it may come as a surprise, I think, to a lot of people, if they haven't been very well acquainted with Islamic history, to learn that Bani al-Abbas were a lot more cruel and ruthless against Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam than were Bani Umayyah. And this requires a very extensive study. We don't have time for that. But when we come to the historical image of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, the damage done by Bani al-Abbas was much greater than the damage done by Bani Umayyah. To give a little bit of context, why would Bani al-Abbas attack the character of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam to the point where it clearly became a character assassination, as we say? You have someone who has a very good character, and at the end of your propaganda and your attacks, you would have everybody agreeing that this is not someone who has a good reputation, this is someone to be left alone or to be criticized, and so on and so forth. To understand this, we need to go back to the beginnings of Bani al-Abbas. You have Bani Umayyah ruling. During their rule, towards the end of their rule, there were many kind of uprisings that happened. One of the groups that decided that they would get together and to fight Bani Umayyah, vowing together, giving a commitment to each other that they will fight Bani Umayyah and that they will try to bring them down, are Bani Hashim. Many of the men of Bani Hashim got together, and of course this is going to include some of the sons from the lineage of Imam al-Hussein, some of the people from the lineage of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, as well as Bani al-Abbas. In general, all of these people taken together can be considered as Bani Hashim. They got together during the time of Bani Umayyah and they vowed that they would fight them. And during that time, one of the people that they all agreed to make their own Khalifa if they were successful was a man by the name of Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn al-Hassan al Mujtaba, sometimes referred to as the Nafs al-Zakiyah. At that time, those people who came together, they viewed him, and they were not wrong in viewing him in this manner, as someone who has a lot of knowledge, a lot of piety, a lot of bravery. He had all the characteristics that would make him an excellent Khalifa. And all of Bani Hashim were behind him. And in fact, they even came to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam at that time, later on, and they told him this is happening, and we are revolting, and this is what we're aspiring to. And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam told them, what you're aspiring to is never going to happen. In any case, there was kind of an agreement between Bani al-Abbas and the lineage of Fatima alayhi salam, and in this case, the grandson of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, so al-Hassan al Mujtaba, who is the son of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, And they all agreed, including people like Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who becomes the second Khalifa in Bani al-Abbas. After As-Saffah, Abu al-Abbas As-Saffah, who is the first Khalifa. After him you have al-Mansur, al-Dawaniqi, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. They all agreed that Nafs al-Zakiyya, Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn al-Hassan al-Muthanna, would be their Khalifa. And of course, their main slogan, Bani al-Abbas at that time, was that they are doing this uprising against Bani Umayyah to return the rights to their rightful owners. But as soon as they were able to seize the power, and as soon as the Umayyad dynasty failed and they took over as Khulafa, the first thing they started doing was to exterminate those with whom they worked to get to those positions. And many of those who were very, very prominent in that movement were actually from the lineage of Imam Hassan alayhi salam. And this is a whole topic that if we look at the history of Islam, you will see that many of the uprisings that took place during the time of the Umayyads, as well as, and mostly during the time of the Abbassids, and even after, they were led mainly by the Hassaniyya, by the Sada who were from the lineage of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. And so at that time, very clearly, the lineage of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam was identified as being a very serious threat, especially because they were oftentimes open in their confrontation of the ruling class of Bani al-Abbas alayhi salam. And in return, Bani al-Abbas were extremely cruel and ruthless in exterminating them. In the case of Muhammad al-Nafs al-Zakiyya, we are told that he basically went into hiding. A lot of his followers were taken and killed. He left with his brother. They went initially they hid, and then they went to Yemen, and from Yemen went to India, and from India they came back in hiding to al-Madinah al-Munawwara. And sometimes this gives us an indication of how is it that we find this lineage from Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam and Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam kind of all over the map. How did those lineages and those families end up in all those places? It's because they were persecuted, and in a lot of cases they had to travel very far to avoid that persecution, and they were followed there. In any case, they came back to al-Madinah al-Munawwara. A lot of the followers were killed. His family members were persecuted and killed, and then after a fight, he was ultimately captured and killed. He was beheaded, and other people in his family were killed as well. At that time, clearly, the Abbasids saw the lineage of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam as being very problematic. So we have documented sermons from people like al-Mansur, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who take to the pulpit, and not only do they attack those people, but they start attacking the character of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. And a lot of what we have about Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam starts coming from that phase of history. It starts there. And they went further in their attacks of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam than Bani Umayyah. So, for instance, we have narrations that tell us, and they're well documented, anyone who goes in history can see them. Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, for instance, who gives a sermon in which he says, for instance, about Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. So he talks about the people who are rising against him, and then he refers to the fact that they are the lineage of Imam al-Hassan, and then he attacks Imam al-Hassan, and he says, one, he was not a real man. And this was kind of a very surprising thing to say. It was not often said, and in that culture and in that environment, these are very big words that are being said, especially from people that are considered to be of the same general tribe. So you have Bani al-Abbas talking in this manner against, their cousins, the sons of Fatima, so as well as, people in Bani Hashim. So they're talking about Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, and they say, first of all, he was not a real man. So in other words, he did not have the bravery and the character, the strength of character to stand up for his rights and to fight Muawyiah, for instance. Secondly, in his sermons, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur says that Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam gave up his imamah. And there is a very intentional use of the word imamah here. So he's not saying he gave up the khilafah, He says he gave up the imamah, and inshallah we're going to talk about this. One of the wisdoms behind the peace treaty was that the imam was able to separate between the imamah and the khilafah, the political rule and the religious authority that would remain with Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam if Muawiyah accepts the conditions of the treaty. Inshallah we're going to talk about that next time we meet. But here you see al-Abbasiyin confusing the people, using the terminology in this confusing way to say Imam al-Hassan gave up his imamah. Imamah is not something you can resign from. You cannot give up your imamah. You're either divinely appointed, just like a prophet, a messenger, you're either divinely appointed as an imam or not. But he says he gave up his imamah in exchange for a little bit of money. And so another attack on the character of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam as not being someone, as we said, and the seeds were already there from Bani Umayyadah, not being a man of conviction and principle. He is swayed and moved by money. The third attack on Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam is that he was tricked. He was tricked into accepting this peace treaty from Muawiyah so that Muawiyah kind of climbs on the throne. And once again, this is an attack in the sense that the Imam is basically a simpleton. He cannot be recognized for his intelligence, for his strategic thinking, for his analysis and understanding of his political acumen, none of that. The Imam is naive, he's simple, he doesn't understand, and Muawiyah is much smarter, and he's the one who won. And finally, an attack that has continued until today. He says all he had time for was marriage and woman. And al-Hassan was someone who would marry a woman and then he would divorce her the next day and go on living his life in this manner. And so, if you look at all of this taken together, you start seeing a certain image that's starting to form around the character of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam in that society. And then, a discussion for another day. But you need to combine to this the efforts that Bani al-Abbas made to hire people to write history according to their own version, according to what was being said. So here you have the official Khalifa speaking publicly. These are the official statements of the state, and this is what's being said. So how do you think that history is going to be written? When they hire someone and they tell him write history, as they actually did, and much of Islamic history started being written at that point, how do you think this is going to be written? What kind of image is going to be presented about Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam? And as we said, we're going to skip the kind of the Shi'i version of history. We're going to come back to that in the next lecture. But then we have the last source of history, which is Orientalism. So first of all, in case the word is kind of new here to some people, first of all, what is Orientalism? This is something that, let's say, an area of scholarship, expertise, let's consider it a knowledge activity that initially began during the European Enlightenment, and then it took much greater proportions as the Europeans went into their heavy colonization phase. As they started colonizing the world, sending their explorers to see what's going on elsewhere outside of Europe and how they can use those parts of the world, of course, experts started appearing who would specialize in the cultures, in the languages, in the religions of those other cultures. And the truth is, and of course here we're simplifying very quickly, but the truth is, Orientalism basically became a branch of, let's call it knowledge, but it was instrumentalized in the way that it would be used to further justify colonizing these other cultures. Because if you are able to show that those cultures are primitive, those cultures are barbaric and savages and backward, uncivilized, and then you compare them with the, let's call it the English West at that time mainly, and so you have the very heavy UK English form of colonialism and the Orientalism that goes with it. And then later on you had the, let's call it the American form of Orientalism that grew out of that type of colonization. In any case, if you look at the work done by Orientalists, especially the early ones, And this is very well documented. I mean, this is an entire field of research and study. Many of them can never be considered as having been people who were objective and coming to the research that they're doing with an unbiased, objective, neutral, genuine interest in the topic to understand it and then to present it to the world. Many of them were coming from a very heavy religious background, many of them doing missionary work, for instance, and attacking Islam and attacking the Arab world specifically on those bases. And you have on the other side those who were working for more political reasons. And so basically today we would say they were doing the work of spies. They were infiltrating societies under the guise of doing scholarship, when in fact what they were doing is doing intelligence work. So a lot of them were on missions, and a lot of them were reporting back what they were finding, and they were given their next mandate or their next mission to perform. And as I said, this is a whole field that could be extensively researched. It's very well documented in a lot of cases. So for those interested, you can go in that area. Why are we talking about this? Because today, I would argue that if you go to the majority of the universities of the world, if you go to those areas that are supposed to be representative of scholarship, academic, university level scholarship about Islam, about people like Imam Hassan alayhi salam, about the peace treaty of Imam Hassan alayhi salam, the view out there, the perception of what transpired in the world, if you ask some big historian, non-Muslims, specifically non-Shia, these are the works that are being read. The works that they study and for which they actually get BAs and MAs and PhDs, and on which they write their PhD dissertations, and they become an expert in Islamic history and Islamic religion and Arab history and so on and so forth, are entirely based on these works, on the works of the Orientalists. And so Orientalists, in addition to Bani Umayyadah and Bani al-Abbas, having presented their own version of who Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam was and why he went ahead with a peace treaty with Muawyiah, you have the Orientalists. And I would argue that the damage that they have done is no less than the damage done by the others. Now perhaps in the Islamic world, the views of Bani Umayyadah and Bani al-Abbas are the ones that are much more in circulation. But I think what we will see today, inshallah, at the end of this will become clear, and we'll try to go as fast as we can, is that what the Orientalists did was to take the problems and the distortions and the fabrications of Bani Umayyadah, combine them to those of Bani al-Abbas, combine them to their own biases and subjective views of who Imam al-Hassan was, and who Ahl al-Bayt were, and who the Arabs and Islam was and is, and then present that even more distorted package to the world. And so, as I said, inshallah, this serves as a case study for people who want to understand how your religion is perceived. And when people are experts, what have they most likely read to become experts in your field? And today, people who are, let's say, the majority of non-Arabs who want to read in English, if you want to read the history of your Imam, you're going to go most likely to perhaps an Encyclopedia of Islam, or Encyclopedia Americana, or any other of the big works that are mostly cited when you want to talk about Islamic history, when you want to talk about Islamic figures. So what I'm trying to do in the last part of this lecture is to go through a number, perhaps a dozen of sources that represent Orientalist views about Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam and the peace treaty. If we fast forward to today, the situation in the Orientalist world is a lot better than it was. Today you have a lot more scholars who are approaching the research related to Islam and related to Islamic history and the Arabs in general in a genuine, objective, neutral way. A lot of scholarship has moved in that direction. Are there still a lot of bad scholarship out there? Absolutely. But the efforts of those who are doing the objective work cannot be denied, first. Secondly, there's a difference between someone who is coming with bad intentions, negative intentions, and right from the beginning, wanting to distort whatever positive they may find and only concentrate on certain things or even fabricate them. And someone who is really trying to find the truth, but every time they look at something, they keep being fed a certain narrative, and so they can only conclude that this is the accurate narrative when it comes, say, to history. And inshallah, we're going to come back to this point, because even though there are a lot of people, I think, who are trying to find the truth when it comes to this and to report it and to present it to the world, when the majority of even the Muslim historians have written from the point of view of Bani Umayya and Bani al-Abbas, including some Shi'i historians who have taken from those points of view, then you can not really blame someone who's coming from the outside of Islam and trying to understand and make sense of all of this when this is all they're being exposed to. And that's why we said it's important to have an analytical thinking when it comes to reading history, and not just reading what's, the black on white words written on the pieces of paper. You need a more than just a superficial reading of history. So very quickly, let's go through some of the sources of, let's call it, Orientalist learning related to Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. Some of these I'm going to skip over because, as I can see, the time is moving really fast. The first one, allow me to skip over. I would say it presents the most recent version of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the one that you would find online if you have the subscription, is going to give you a more or less fairer treatment of the topic. Important to know, because this also can become, if someone is interested in a PhD thesis, this is a good one to write. You can actually show where there has been evolution and why. And this basically tells you that more recent expertise, even when it's going to the Orientalist writings of a few generations ago, is aboard and considers it absolutely unacceptable, and so there's a lot of rewriting being done right now. That said, as we will see, there's still a lot of recent writing that is absolutely unacceptable when it comes to the story of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. So let's go to the version of 1920 from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Yes. So here you have, very quickly, so this is an entry on both Hassan and Hussein. So both the sons of Imam Ali alayhi salam and Fatima al-Zahra. We are told the fourth Muhammadan Khalifa, Ali alayhi salam, they're his sons by his wife Fatima, daughter of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. On Ali's death, Hassan was proclaimed caliph. But the strength of Muawyiah, who had rebelled against Ali, was such that he secret negotiation between the Imam and Muawiyah. The secret negotiation came to the ears of Hassan's supporters. A mutiny broke out and Hassan was wounded. He retired to Medina, where he died about 669. The story that he was poisoned at Muawiyah's instigation is generally discredited. Subsequently, his brother Hussein was invited by partisans in Kufa to revolt against Muawiyah's successor Yazid. He was, however, defeated and killed at Karbala on the 10th of Muharram, year 680. Hussein is the hero of the Persian play, which is performed annually on the anniversary of his death by the Shiites of Persia and India, to whom from the earliest times the family of Ali are the only true descendants of Muhammad. The play lasts for several days and concludes with the carrying out of the coffins of the martyrs to an open place in the neighborhood. This is the entry in Encyclopedia Britannica. Keep in mind this version. Let's go to a book that is, generally speaking, praised by a lot of Muslim scholars as being objective. This, to me, looks like the PhD thesis of a well-known Polish Orientalist, Jajewska, in her book called Tarikh al-Dawla al-Islamiyya wal-Tashri'iyya in 1996. published, 1966 published. She writes, after the murder of Ali, his followers gave their allegiance to his son Hassan, who remained 6 months as caliph, but Muawiyah would not bend to his will, and they were on the verge of wars during the time of his father. But Hassan thought about the matter and he understood the circumstances of his time in a wise way. He hated to create fitna and liked to create harmony between the Muslims. So he thought that the best interest of the Muslims was in giving up the Khilafah to Muawiyah, and he agreed to a truce with conditions that both of them agreed to. He wrote to Muawiyah handing over the Khilafah and paying his allegiance and giving over Kufa towards the end of the month of Rabi' al-Awwal, year 41, and that is how he was truly, as the messenger had said about him, this son of mine is a master and God will unite through him between two great factions of Muslims. And peace and tranquility reigned over the Muslims that year, and they called it the year of the unity, and this was year 41. Keep these words in mind, inshallah, until the next lecture. But these are the much fairer, much more objective assessment of the situation. Let's go to the Encyclopedia of Islam, and this is an entry written by Madelung, one of the very, very famous Orientalists, considered, very highly respected, very highly cited. So he writes, and of course I'm not going to read all of this. I don't know if it shows on the screen, but there's a little dot, a red dot on the second line. This is what I'm going to start reading. So for those following, I don't know if it's clear or not. So he writes that, so this is after Imam Ali alayhi salam, although Ali, probably following the Prophet's precedent, refused to appoint a successor after having been mortally struck, his eldest son al-Hassan, grandson of Muhammad, was immediately recognized without dissent. A few months later, al-Hassan abdicated, so he gave up his khilafah in favor of the Umayyad Muawyiah, on the basis of a treaty which stipulated a full amnesty and safety of life and property for the Shia of Ali, and which denied Muawiyah the right to appoint a successor. According to some accounts, it provided for al-Hassan to succeed him, according to others for election by a council, a shura, evidently on the model of the electoral council appointed by Umar. So obviously, would you think that Imam al-Hassan would follow the same model as used by Umar ibn al-Khattab? Keep in mind, although the abdication aroused general disappointment and some protest among the Shia, it was not regarded as a renunciation by al-Hassan of his ultimate title to the leadership, and he continued to be recognized as the legitimate Imam. Again, see the distinction that he makes, because he's being objective, between the Khilafah and the Imamah, which, as we said, Bani al-Abbas tried to kind of efface or erase. Al-Hassan died in year 49 of Hijrah or 51 al-Hijrah, poisoned. It was widely suspected by one of his wives at the instigation of Muawiyah. The Shia now turned to his younger brother al-Hussein, and disaffected by what they regarded as the oppressive and vindictive nature of Muawiyah's rule, urged him to rise to restore the legitimate reign of the Prophet's family, although by character more inclined to pursue the leadership actively than his brother. Al-Hussein declined to act as long as Muawiyah was reigning, evidently recognizing the continued validity of al-Hassan's agreement. So here, a very fair, objective assessment, except for some points here and there, including the nuance and the difference of character between Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein, to keep in mind. If you take the 1913 edition, because this was the much more recent edition, if you take the 1913 edition of the entry, we have him, and this is not Madelung writing, but Strothman. He writes that Imam al-Hassan could not really be counted among the caliphs of the Islamic world, because he reigned for too short of a time. And as for Ali, his khilafah was very short, between years 35 and 40, and it was not unanimously accepted by all Muslims, and much disagreement happened as a result. So basically, in the earlier version of this article, they dismiss not only the khilafah of Imam al-Hassan entirely, as though he was never a khalifa, but the khilafah of Imam Ali alayhi salam, because it was not a matter of consensus, when he was obviously the legitimate khalifa, as Muawiyah knew and he said. Anyways, we'll come back to that inshallah, so things to keep in mind. Let's go to the Encyclopedia Americana, another work that is cited a lot. This is the 13th volume in the 1919 edition. So if we go to, once again, look for the red dots, please. So they are towards the bottom of the page, a little bit lower here, and it starts here. So I'm going to read this part and a couple of sentences from the next part, next column. So he says, after the death of his father Ali in 661, Hassan was proclaimed caliph by the Arabians. But he was a faint-hearted, poor-spirited creature, entirely different from his valiant father and masterful grandfather. Ali's powerful rival Muawyiah, now determined to assert his title to the whole Muslim empire, already recognized as Khalifa in Syria and Egypt, he gathered an army and marched against Kufa to oust Hassan. The latter, however, nicknamed the Divorcer, and we're going to have a lot more details around that, was more intent on varying the composition of his ever-changing harem than on the business of public life and military enterprise. After a brief and inglorious reign of 6 months, Hassan resigned the Khilafah to Muawiyah and retired with his household and his brother to Medina. Here Hassan died by poison administered by one of his wives who had been bribed with promise to commit this act by Yazid, son of Muawiyah, and he goes on. So there's a lot more to say, but we're starting to see the things that we talked about start to appear very clearly. In the next one, in the next source, Encyclopedia of Islam. So as you guess, let's say you're in a university library and you're looking for a main source on Islam, I assure you that this is one of the first ones that people are going to be consulting. Encyclopedia of Islam, 2nd edition, volume 3, and this is, the more recent version. Once again, please look for the red dots. So in this case, they're on the right of the page at about halfway. We start at about halfway. Yes. So here he is telling us, this is a very long entry. I'm only reading some passages because I'm going to be coming back to them. He's telling us that after Imam Hassan alayhi salam, tried to get his army to fight, the rumors started spreading that there was a secret deal, as he's saying, being put in place between him and Muawiyah, and the people attacked him. So he continues by saying, bleeding profusely, the people attacked Imam Hassan alayhi salam, and they jabbed him with a dagger, and he started bleeding profusely. Al-Hassan was carried to Al-Mada'in and cared for in the governor's house. After this, the news of the attack on Al-Hassan became widely known, having been purposely divulged by Muawiyah, and it led to desertions. Muawiyah advanced as far as a certain region facing the troops of Ubaydullah encamped at Meskin, and then at the same time he advanced, his advance guard approached Al-Mada'in. It was here that the negotiations, which had probably been some time earlier in spite of the opposition of al-Hussein, so this is the point I'm trying to make here, to show this constant disagreement and bickering between Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein, between Imam al-Hassan and Imam Ali, between Imam al-Hussein and Imam Ali, and so on and so forth. We're going to see a lot of that. In spite of the opposition of Imam al-Hussein, and had been continued by means of envoys representing the two disputing parties, came to a successful conclusion. Al-Hassan's troops had no wish to fight, and each day an increasing number of Iraqis joined Muawiyah. The conditions of the agreement concerning Al-Hassan's abdication, on the matter of the conditions of the agreement there are in the sources certain variants which it is impossible to correct and reconcile. According to some accounts, Muawiyah gave carte blanche, but in respect to what? To Al-Hassan, and we're going to come back to that inshaAllah, who later regretted not having asked for more. Again, see the insistence on the greed and the selfishness of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam and his worldly character. The compensation in money was the sum of 1 million dirham. And then he continues by saying, and the revenue from a district in Persia, which Al-Hassan was never able to collect since the people of Basra, because the collection of that went usually back to Basra first, and the people of Basra were hostile, maintaining that it was a dependency on their own. Some traditions add other conditions which, however, must be suspected of having been interpolated later in order to reduce the criticisms brought against Al-Hassan and to show that he had raised certain problems and held firm in regard to his own point of view. These are the conditions, and then he goes on listing some of the conditions. Again, so words to keep in mind. In the next page, we continue in the same article. Again, please, and this time look at the right of the right column. He continues saying, having settled in Medina, al-Hassan, so this is after the peace treaty, Muawyiah accepts, al-Hassan accepts, Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam goes back with Imam al-Hussein and the rest of their family from Kufa, where he was a Khalifa. Because he gave up all of that, he goes to the city of Medina. Now this is what he tells us. Having settled in Medina, al-Hassan lived quietly. And this is something I really want you to keep in mind. Why is it so quiet? Okay? He lived quietly, at least in appearance, without engaging in politics. As before, he went from one marriage to another, so earning for himself the title of al-Matlaq, the divorcer. He had 60 or 70 or 90 wives and 300 or 400 concubines. This life of sensual pleasures does not appear, however, to have aroused much censure. In year 49 after Hijrah, he died of a somewhat prolonged illness or else from poisoning attributed by many of the sources to one of his wives by the name of Ja'dah, daughter of al-Ash'ath. Muawiyah is said to have suborned her with the promise of a large sum of money and of marrying her to Yazid, but it should be noted that al-Hassan was in no way anxious to reveal his suspicions to his brother al-Hussein for fear that vengeance for his death might be taken against some innocent person. The Yemeni chief al-Ash'ath was regarded by the Shia as a traitor in the pay of Muawiyah, and it is quite possible that that his hatred felt for him had been transferred to his daughter. So the hatred that the Shia had for al-Ash'ath, Ja'dah bint al-Ash'ath, so her father, they basically put the blame on her instead because they already hated her father. As he is saying here, al-Hassan had expressed the wish to be buried beside his grandfather Muhammad, but Marwan ibn al-Hakam and Aisha together agreed to prevent al-Hussein from carrying out this request. They were on the point of taking up arms, but al-Hassan had stated that in the event of opposition, he could be buried in Baqi', and Abu Hurairah convinced al-Hussein that the best course would be to take this solution. Weirdly, Abu Hurairah comes into the story. As we do not know the exact dates either of the agreement for the abdication or of the official ceremony at Kufa, the length of al-Hassan's Khilafah cannot be determined. The sources confronted with the same difficulty give different periods, 5 months and 10 days, 6 months and a few days, 8 months and 10 days. And then he goes on telling us about some of the attributes of al-Hassan alayhi salam. He says al-Hassan's physical and moral attributes. This grandson of Muhammad was the one who resembled him the most closely, according to Abu al-Faraj al-Asfahani. He had a defect of speech inherited from one of his uncles. It is sometimes added that he was a good orator. He is said to have been a ruler of mild disposition who never lost his composure, generous and pious. It was his piety that he made It was from piety that he made numerous pilgrims on foot, but the information that we possess about him stops short at this point, and the absence of any praise of his intelligence, skill, or bravery is striking. He was a personage who shone with a reflected light, so it's not his own light, he reflects the light. If people talk about al-Hassan for any reason at all, it's because of the light emanating from his grandfather and parents. Okay, so this is Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, and if we continue maybe a last part in this specific article. So in the next page, we have to the left this time at the top of the page, we have the abdication of al-Hassan, so the giving up of Imam al-Hassan of the Khilafah, so much criticized in his own time by many of his supporters, thus did not invalidate his position as Imam. He says the Shia continued to believe in him as an Imam. His conduct was justified as springing from his pious detachment from mundane matters. The gap left by the lack of extraordinary qualities was filled in Shi'i texts by accounts of his miracles. And then he lists a few miracles of Imam al-Hassan to say this is how the Shia basically fabricated miracles to compensate for this lackluster, simple, lacking intelligence, bravery, so on and so forth, Imam of theirs. Okay, now let's go to the next source. This one is, well, al-Hassan. I think I have two quick mentions here from him. The first one comes from a book called The Kingdom and Fall of the Arabs. I'm reading the parts that are underlined. Meanwhile, turbulent movements were taking place against Hassan, Ali's son and successor. He had no wish for war, although he had at his back 40,000 men eager to fight, and after 6 months took the opportunity of abdicating the sovereignty and becoming reconciled with Muawiyah. So keep in mind that he had absolutely, as is claimed, no desire for war. This general summary is authenticated but the exact course of affairs after Ali's murder is related with confusion and incompleteness. And then he tells us the version from az-Zuhri. Az-Zuhri, who was a well-known Nasibi, although it looks like at the end of his life, he became one of the followers of Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam. He lived at about that time. But for the rest of his life, he was known for his hatred of Imam Ali alayhi salam. Very well known. Every single biographer of his will tell you that. In any case, he reports the version of az-Zuhri. So he says al-Hassan wanted to make the best terms he could with Muawiyah. He deposed Qais, so the commander that Imam Ali had put on top of the army. He deposed Qais because he opposed him in his peace aspirations with Muawiyah. He had already made the Kufites suspicious by his ambiguous behavior at the paying of homage. So the Imam was weird when they were giving allegiance to him as Khalifa, and they decided that he was not the man for them. Not long after, he had a proof of their feelings towards him by a lance thrust which he received on an occasion not very closely specified. So we don't know why they attacked him. Thereupon he began negotiations with Muawiyah, renounced the rule for a large sum of money, and was sorry afterwards that he had not demanded twice as much. Thereupon the army again chose Qais as their leader, with the commission to carry on the war until the adherents of Ali, who were under Qais, were guaranteed amnesty and security for their belongings and their life. This he easily gained, Imam al-Hassan gained from Muawiyah, to whom it meant a good deal to win him over, but he did not take the money that was offered to himself and made no dealings for his own hand. And then, so the next I think is just a picture of this, so it's just a screenshot. In his book, The Khawarij and the Shia, al-Hassan, the same author, writes, the eldest son of Ali from Fatima, al-Hassan, died year 49. He had completely disappointed the hopes of the followers of his father because of the manner in which he gave up and abdicated the Khilafah, therefore losing their respect, so their attention turned towards his younger brother, Hussein. The next, Henri Massé, in his book, L'Islam, he writes that after the death of Ali, his followers, the followers of Ali, called on his son, Imam al-Hassan, to take over as Khalifa, but he was incompetent for that role. All he could think of was to negotiate with Muawiyah to give him a lot of money in exchange for giving up the Khilafah. He retired to Medina, where he died while still young. They're going to build on the while still young soon. In the History of the Arabs by Philip Khoury Hitti. And this is from pages 189 to 191. So I'm reading the underlined passages, it's too long to read. Al-Iraq now declared, so this is Muawiyah. Muawiyah is trying to become a Khalifa. He says basically Muawiyah became the Khalifa and he was the legitimate Khalifa, except that in Iraq the people declared al-Hassan, the eldest son of Ali and Fatima, the legitimate successor of Ali, and Mecca and Medina were lukewarm in their loyalty to the representation of the Sufyanids, who had failed to acknowledge Muhammad until the fall of Mecca, and whose Islam was therefore considered of convenience rather than conviction. So the interests of al-Hassan, who was more at home, please notice, who was more at home in the harem than on the throne, lay in fields other than those of imperial administration. It was not long before he abdicated in favor of his more able rival and retired to Al-Madinah to a life of ease and pleasure, a step which he was induced to take by Muawiyah's guarantee of a magnificent subsidy and pension. And then he continues a little bit later, though he died at the age of 45, possibly poisoned because of some harem intrigue, al-Hassan is said to have made and unmade no less than 100 marriages, which earned him the title of Matlaq, or the great divorcer. Okay, Let's continue with the next one. Anthony Nutting. He says in his book, A Narrative History from Muhammad to the Present, out of respect for Ali's memory, so for no other reason, not because they saw him as being qualified for this, out of respect for Ali's memory, the Kufans elected Hassan caliph on his father's death. A lethargic creature, someone who is lazy, passive, doesn't act, a lethargic creature who preferred the security and luxury of the old Persian capital, Ctesiphon, to the dangers and rigors of the battlefield, and who earned the nickname of the great divorcer from his many marriages, which some say totaled 100, Hassan made but one gesture to save his throne. He sent an army from Kufa against Muawiyah, but when the rumor reached Ctesiphon, so he keeps insisting that the Imam is actually in Persia at this time, that it has been defeated, Hassan promptly abdicated to Muawiyah's favor. And later he says, Hassan was not shy of asking, when he finally had the treaty in place, Hassan was not shy of asking and stipulated in his reply that he should be allowed to keep the 5 million pieces in the Kufa treasure. Then, pocketing his undeserved gains, he retired to Medina, where 8 years later he was poisoned by one of his wives. Karl Brockelman, in The History of the Islamic Peoples, 1960, and this is translated, writes, Muawiyah had already set out on the road through Mesopotamia to Iraq before Ali's assassination. At first, Ali's incompetent son had assumed the succession, but he could not be induced to lead his troops into attack. He says his own people were unable to convince him to actually attack. He consented to negotiations with Muawiyah and waived his claims in return for his being left the 5 million dirhams in the state treasury at Kufa. Abdullah ibn Abbas, the ancestor of the Abbasid dynasty, later to come into power, had already made off with the public treasure chest of Basra and joined forces with Muawiyah. Okay. The next source, Dwight Donaldson, in his book, The Religion of the Shiite, the Shia religion, pages 66 to 74, way too many pages to read, although I think all of it deserves to be read. The things that he highlights, and we're going to read a few passages around that, he completely rejects as a fabrication into Islam the entire idea of there being imams. That maybe the Holy Prophet or Allah would have left, imams after the Prophet as successors, religious authorities. He basically completely takes the Salafi version of history, the Umayyad version of history, in his entire book. In any case, he rejects the idea or belief that there was anything like an imamah. So imamah is entirely a fabrication. He completely confirms the myth of Abdullah ibn Saba as being the one who basically created this new madhab, this new school of thought called Shi'ism. And then he goes on creating a whole lot of other things related to Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. So allow me to, so on the first page, I am at page 67, on the right, where it starts with, but Islam is no longer a united Arabian community. So now we are talking when Muawiyah is in power, Islam no longer a united Arabian community, to be governed solely by the ancient customs of the tribes. Ideas of succession by heredity had come to be familiar to those who had shared in expeditions of conquest against the Byzantine Empire in the West, and also to those who had made up armies of occupation in the vanquished empire of the Persians. And there was the teaching of Ibn Saba that Ali, as Muhammad's wasi, had received from the Prophet a certain divine light or spirit that he could transmit to whom he chose. And during the 4 years of Ali's Khilafah, the Muslim empire had been divided. They had been years of civil strife which had drawn sharp lines between the East and the West. The arbitration plan that was provided for in the armistice after the Battle of Siffin had failed to effect any united sentiment. For a time, the two rival Khulafa, Ali and Muawiyah, had publicly cursed one another in their prayers. So here he said basically that Muslims learned this idea of imamah, or someone inheriting from someone else from outside of the Islamic world, because they went outside of the Islamic world and they went back to their pre-Islamic days. One. Two, there is Abdullah ibn Saba having created this idea around Imam Ali that he's an Imam. And then he says that Imam Ali alayhi salam was cursing Muawiyah and Muawiyah was cursing Imam Ali. I don't know what sources anyone has for this claim that Imam Ali was cursing anyone. But clearly, yes, well established that Muawiyah was cursing Imam Ali and he made it a law. And the next page, page 68 if possible, if you go to the bottom of the page, perhaps the most reliable Shi'i account of what occurred after the death of Ali. So here he says there's a lot of ambiguity, but then he says, perhaps the most reliable Shiite account of what occurred after the death of Ali is that which is given by Abu Hanifa al-Daynawari, who wrote the Kitab al-Akhbar al-Tiwal, or the Book of Long Histories. This book is most important as it is written from the Shia point of view, earlier than any of the canonical traditionists, a full 100 years before the Muslim invasion of India. And as a matter of fact, Daynawari died only 20 years after the last Imam is supposed to have disappeared. And then he goes on telling us what Daynawari wrote. He was not a Shia as he claims. He was entirely 100% a Sunni scholar. There is a completely someone else who wrote, he did not write Kitab al-Akhbar al-Tiwal. There are other Daynawaris who are Shia, but not him. And here this whole claim is based on this fact. So he's apparently going to early Shia history, but that is not the case. In any case, in the next small passage, very small, right here, because it starts those two lines and then I'm going to continue. This is a punchline here. But whatever his superficial likeness to the Prophet may have been, the records show clearly that Hassan lacked the moral force, and then we continue. He lacked the moral force, the courage, the self-discipline, the intellectual capacity to be a successful leader of his people. As he has been summarily estimated in the Encyclopedia of Islam, sensuality and a lack of energy and intelligence seem to have been the fundamental features of his character. After the premature death of Fatima, he was not on particularly good terms with his father and brothers. He spent the best part of his youth in making and unmaking marriages. About 100 are enumerated. These easy morals earned him the title Mutlaq, the divorcer, and involved Ali in serious enmities. So Imam Ali had a lot of enemies because of how much Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam was marrying and divorcing. Hassan moreover proved a thorough spendthrift, so he's wasteful of money. He allotted to each of his wives a considerable establishment. We thus see how the money was scattered during the Khilafah of Ali, already much impoverished. So the Khilafah of Imam Ali did not have sufficient funds because all the money was being taken by Imam al-Hassan to spend on all of his wives. Then he continues, the Shia themselves acknowledge that Hassan had 60 wives and numerous concubines. So, good luck showing me any Shia sources for this. For we read that the wives to whom he was legally married numbered 60, besides concubines and temporary wives. The number 300 and 900 have also been given, but he divorced many of them. On this account, His Excellency was called al-Mutlaq, the man who divorces many wives. Complaint had been made to Ali by prominent men that Hassan was continually marrying their daughters and continually divorcing them, and Ali's only answer had been that they should refuse to give him their daughters to wife. During his period of retirement in Medina, so after the peace treaty, there is little of actual achievement to relate. Again, keep that in mind, please. Muawiyah paid his expenses, so Muawiyah paid the expenses of Imam al-Hassan, and he continued his dissipation, in consequence of which he is said to have died of tuberculosis when he was about 45 years of age. But aside from matters of actual history, whether it be on account of his recognized inferiority or for other reasons, there are a smaller number of miracles attributed to al-Hassan than to most of the other Imams. There are only 16 mentioned, and then he goes on listing the 16 that he found. And maybe I can stop here and leave the rest to the next time that we meet, but I think the points are clear that we're trying to make. I kind of left the best for last, but I'm going to skip it over and maybe we can start with those the next time we meet. So we are going to leave the consulmen and Lamens. So Lamens is, one well-known historian and Orientalist who did not even hide his hatred and his attacks on Islam all the time. In any case, the general conclusions that we reach from looking at the works of Orientalists. These are supposed to be people who have objective expertise, because this is how they are presented, this is how they present themselves, this is how they present themselves to the world, and this is how many present them to the world as, they're objective. They don't have any stake in the situation. They want to be neutral. They want to tell us what they find as they go through history. But the truth is, they were not neutral. And when we are going to provide the alternate version, inshallah, the next time we meet, you're going to see the discrepancies and which type of character did they chose to present, which version of Imam Hassan alayhi salam they explicitly decided to present to the world. And what we are going to present is 100% entirely based on works of history that Muslim historians have written. So here you can see that there was definitely a picking and choosing. And this is where you start seeing that perhaps it's not as much of an objective, neutral, expert exercise that's being done as one with hidden agendas. That's one thing to keep in mind. The second one, from everything we said, clearly none of them showed any analytical power, any ability to read beyond the words that they are reading. So in other words, they're just taking the words that they're finding in a history and relating them as is. So not clear where the historian's work is in this, when there is no ability to show where's the context, what are the justification, what makes someone decide something and not something else. That's something else to keep in mind. And then the last point that I would say is that whether you go to these historians, these Orientalists with agendas, or you go to the more recent ones that I think many of whom have really tried to be objective in their research, I don't want to say that there is no accountability and responsibility on the researcher himself. But clearly, a lot of the responsibility lays on the shoulders of the Muslim scholars. Because what the Orientalists are doing is going back to those sources that are basically telling these stories, and when they see that this is the crushing majority of the versions that are being presented, then they consider those to be the actual authentic version of history. And so, first and foremost, those who began all of this were definitely the Umayyads and the Abbassids, and those who decided to perpetuate the lies that were fabricated against Imam Hassan alayhi salam in the first place. And then when you add another layer of these non-Muslims who are attacking the religion and attacking everything that is represented and representative of this religion, such as the Holy Prophet and his book and his family, then you see what kind of distortion you get when they come to a character like Imam Hassan alayhi salam and the peace treaty and the reasons behind it, reconfirming the narrative of the uncivilized, barbaric, selfish, so on and so forth, simpleton who lives in that part of the world. This is kind of the general conclusion about the work of the Orientalists. Beyond this, I think it's important to recognize, we cannot emphasize enough how influential these Orientalists are and how influential their works are. And this in turn means that we need to be aware of the responsibility that we have in making sure that the image that is presented to the rest of the world of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam is not this image. And unfortunately, this is not just a matter of, giving lectures, writing a book, translating a book. These are valiant, good, commendable efforts. But the truth is, as many books as have been written and translated, and they're starting to be available, alhamdulillah, if you go to a Western university and you look at their library shelves, these are not the works that you're going to find. The works of the Shia scholars, the works of our youth, the documentaries that we're providing and we're creating, all other work that is happening to present the truthful image of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, is not happening at a professional level sufficiently to actually dethrone and remove this image of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, of Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam, as the one that is deeply anchored through the Orientalist texts. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it starts from all of us. In the next lecture, we will inshallah try to present a more accurate understanding of the treaty of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, a better understanding of the context that led to Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam opting for a peace treaty with Muawyiah, and maybe as a derivative of that, answering some of the issues that are being raised against the character of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. Maybe they're more related to his biography, but quickly we can also talk about, the great divorcer, al-Mutlaq, and how many wives did he actually have, and his moral character. Was he really the weakling, miserable, unsupported man that he is presented to be, unfortunately, sometimes even by the Shia themselves? And how was he in the years that followed the peace treaty until his martyrdom, his assassination by Ju'da bint al-Ash'ath through the bribe of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us in understanding the lives and extracting the lessons from the lives of Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam in a way that is practical and in a way that we can apply in our daily lives. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us a knowledge of this great Imam in this life and his intercession in the next life. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.